The final step in finishing our quilt is to bind the edges. Start by cutting strips of fabric 2 1/4 inches wide. Then sew the strips together by matching edges perpendicularly and sewing across the diagonal. Trim the excess away and press the seam open. You'll need enough binding to go around the perimeter of your quilt plus a little extra. Press the binding in half and then match the raw edges of the binding to the raw edge of your quilt. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch the binding to your quilt. Start in the middle of one of your sides and leave a few inches loose before you start sewing. When we get to a corner, stop a 1/4 inch from the end and backstitch. Remove the quilt from your machine and fold the binding up so that a 45-degree angle is formed, pointing at the corner, and the binding extends straight from the side that you're about to bind. Fold the binding back down and proceed with sewing that edge. When you get close to your starting point, stop early so that you have 6 to 8 inches left to sew. Match the binding to determine where they will meet. Then leave a 1/4 inch between them and fold over the binding and finger press to mark. Match the binding edges perpendicular to one another, aligning the center mark you just made. Sew diagonally to connect the two ends. Trim the excess and finger press the seam open. The binding should be the perfect length for the remainder of your quilt. Stitch the last bit of binding in place. Now I'll show you 2 ways to finish the binding off. The first option is to finish by hand, which is less visible but time consuming. Wrap binding to back and use binding clips or pins to hold in place as needed, especially at the corners. Thread a needle using thread that matches your binding or quilt back. Knot the end of your thread and anchor your thread inside the seam allowance of the quilt. Use a slip stitch or whip stitch to stitch the binding down. When you get to the corner, you may want to add a stitch along the fold of the corner to keep it looking nice and neat. When you get to the end of your binding, knot your final stitch and tuck the needle into the binding. Pull the thread taut and snip against the fabric so the end of the thread will disappear within the binding. You can also finish the binding by machine, which is more visible but also much quicker to complete. Again, use binding clips or pins to hold the binding in place. Working on the right side of the quilt, stitch in the ditch along the binding seam. You want to be catching the binding on the underside as you sew, so make sure the binding extends a bit further than the seam allowance.